Today's story is weird. Can I get an amen on that? It's a very strange story, full of these evocative yet disturbing images of a man who's so gripped by possession that he can burst out of chains and runs around naked in a tomb, in a cemetery. A herd of pigs suddenly hurtling down a hill to their deaths into the water, and the inevitable aftermath of a whole herd of pigs floating in the water, which is what the locals see. And of course, at the end, the locals just begging Jesus, leave, get out of here, don't cause any more trouble. It's a very, very strange story. And one of the reasons it's strange is because most of us today, here in the West, don't really have any experience with spiritual possession. There's very few times where someone will say to you, I'm having trouble, I think a demon has possessed me. Sometimes we'll use as a figure of speech what has possessed that person, but we don't really mean it in terms of a demon. But when anthropologists have surveyed this world of ours, they find that actually most people outside of the industrialized West still do believe in spirit possession. This is a very, very common idea. You can find it in Africa and Asia and South America. Spiritual possession is still considered a reasonable explanation for mental health and physical health problems in lots of cultures. They tend to be agrarian cultures, not just tribal cultures deep in the jungle somewhere, but agrarian cultures, people who raise herds, people who have crops. Spirit possession is considered very normal. So why would that be? Well, if you are in charge of a herd of animals, like a herd of pigs in this story, or cattle, the chances of sudden terrible misfortune occurring is always realistic, right? 1 week you've got 100 pigs, the next week a wolf has killed half of them, or some sort of disease has hurt them, or perhaps there's been a flood and your herd has been washed away. These things happen, and they happen often enough that anthropologists believe that people evolved an idea saying, okay, that is so out of the ordinary that my herd could be here 1 week and gone the next, that something supernatural must have interceded. And all over the world, people believe that there are evil spirits who can take over their herds and cause misfortune to their herds. And of course, given that idea about how spirits interact with animals, it was inevitable that they would start to explain human misfortune in the same way. So if someone is suffering from what we would see as severe mental distress, mental illness distress, they would say, oh, well, a spirit has possessed that person. And the same thing with many health problems. Today's story takes place among a culture that believe in spirit possession, as many people do now. And one of the things which makes spirit possession more likely in cultures that believe in it is when those cultures are under heavy stress. Something traumatic has been happening to them. Like when their land has been invaded by a foreign power, and there is a sitting military in your neighborhood, in your land. That is enough to cause people to believe that spirits are taking up residence in the individuals in their culture. Today's story is tapping into all of those beliefs. And there's one word in the story which gives the clue about what's really going on. For any exorcism to work, the first step is you have to ask the demon their name. That's the very first thing. And when Jesus asks the man who's being possessed, "What is your name, demon?" he responds, "Legion." Now, legion means many, means lots. But the word in Greek, which is used in the gospel here, is explicitly the military term for legion. A Roman legion had 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers, and there were 4 legions who were stationed in Syria, which is where this story is happening, on the other side of the Lake of Galilee. So this story has been interpreted as a kind of allegory for a people who have been conquered by the Romans. The Romans came, they conquered Israel, and the people desperately want them to leave. And so when Jesus says, "What is your name, demon?" and he says, "Legion," that's our clue that, This story isn't just about what happened to one individual 2,000 years ago, but it's actually also a commentary on what was happening to thousands of people on both sides of Galilee because the Romans had colonized them and had conquered them. So what happens in the story? Well, the demons say, "Don't throw us into the abyss. We don't want that to happen." And keep in mind, this story is being told to Jews who desperately want a Messiah to arrive, who is going to raise an army and get rid of the Romans and just get the Romans out of Israel. And so for them, it would make sense that when Jesus, the Messiah, arrives, he would try to get rid of the Romans. And this story is an allegory of that. So the demons say, "Don't throw us into the abyss. Don't make the things which happened in the book of Revelation happen yet. Just give us a place to transfer now." And Jesus says, "Yeah, sure, not a problem." So they transfer into a herd of pigs. Jews don't eat pigs, right? It's just, pigs are unclean animals. So the fact that there's a herd of pigs on Jewish land shows that in this story that this is an area which has been conquered by the Romans and the Gentiles are raising unclean animals to eat. Okay. So, but the thing about colonized people is that they really want the colonizers to go away. So when they heard this story, they would have thought what happened next was funny, because they don't care about pigs. Pigs are disgusting. It would be like having a herd of rats next door, right? We don't care what happens to rats, because even now we consider them unclean. The demons transfer out of this man, and they go into the herd of pigs, and what happens next? The pigs are just overwhelmed by the sudden occupation of their minds by this legion of demons, and they rush off the cliff, and they land in the water, and they die. So the demons' plan is completely backfired. They wanted safety, but what they got was the abyss of the lake. So to Jewish ears, this is a funny story. They said, "Please, Messiah, let us transfer." And the Messiah said, "Yeah, sure, but it's going to be the end of you." So this story from their perspective has a happy ending when those pigs go into the water and the man is finally able to come to his senses. So it's a story not just about that man, but also about the political situation in Israel at that time. And it's interesting for us because it gives us an insight into how colonization works. For colonizers, like the Romans, there's only two stages to colonization. You arrive, you conquer. That's it. Happily ever after, you conquered the land, it's yours, the people are subjugated, and you just enjoy the fruits of your invasion. You arrive, you conquer, it's over. Colonized people, however, as this story shows us, they see it as a little more complicated than that. There was a time before the colonizers arrived. Then the colonizers arrive, they conquer, and then the next stage, you dream of them going away. You want colonization to end. You want it to be over. You want the Romans to leave. And that's what this story imagines. The Messiah will come and get rid of the Romans. He'll expel them. The possession of the land will be over. So, two different narratives. Colonizers, we came, we conquered, happy ending. Colonized, they came, they conquered, and we want them to leave. We want our freedom back. Those two perspectives, which we can see in this story, are also in play in Canada right now. For the Indigenous people of Canada, they used to have this place to themselves. We arrived. We said we would share the land. We didn't. They were conquered, and we're still here. For the English and the French, they arrived. They felt that they had the right to conquer. They did conquer. They made agreements they didn't honor. They pushed Indigenous people off their lands, took over the cities and the land, and from a colonizer's point of view, that's the end of the story. The happy ending is Canada. Canada, a place that Europeans took over and kept. That's it. There is no one more stage of the story. That's it. We're here. We won, they lost. That's the way the colonizers tell the story. Now we know it's not quite that simple, but that's the colonizer's point of view. And when we know that in the mid-19th century, around the same time as the Canadian state was being put together, they decided, the colonizers, that the best thing that could happen to the Indigenous people would be for them to just simply be absorbed into the white Canadian culture, right? That's why the residential school system was created. They called it back then the Indian problem. We still use that word Indian. They called it the Indian problem because they wanted the Indigenous people to simply go away, become like immigrants from everywhere else. Just fit in, learn the language, go to school, get jobs, and stop talking about your culture. And the way they enforced that, of course, was through the residential school system. And by 1920, the superintendent of the residential school system, Duncan Campbell Scott, famous Canadian poet, had this to say about how he perceived the Indian problem. Sorry, I need to move closer to see it. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that is not being absorbed into the body politic. And there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill. So that's the voice of a colonizer. Someone who says, we came, we conquered, you deal with it, just get absorbed into our society. But of course, that's not quite what happened. The residential school system did not successfully absorb Indigenous people and make their culture disappear. Instead, they became what they are now, a body of people whom the Indigenous author Thomas King has called, they've become inconvenient Indians. And what he means by that is they're still here, and they're still making a claim to their culture and their perspective and the right to be here as a thriving culture. King talks about it, so this is what Thomas King looks like with his book, and here's what he has to say about inconvenient Indians. Dead Indians, the ones that the colonized people want to deal with, Indians from the past, dead Indians are dignified, noble, silent, and suitably garbed, and dead. Live Indians are invisible, unruly, disappointing, and breathing. One is a romantic reminder of a heroic but fictional past. The other is simply an unpleasant contemporary surprise. What he means by this is that Western culture likes Indigenous people, but we like Indigenous people as they were when colonization began, when they still lived in teepees and longhouses, and when they still wore fancy headdresses, and when they could be a fun part of our adventures. So Hollywood movies still has Indigenous people, often played by white people, like Johnny Depp in the Lone Ranger remake. We like Indigenous people to sort of be time capsule people. This is who they are. But when they assert themselves in the present, then we start to get kind of upset. Indigenous people will remind us that actually a lot of the land which we're living on isn't our original land, and we deserve to have more land, that we've been cheated out of our land. And from a colonial perspective, we tend to think about the Indian problem in its modern aspect as being mostly about land. Every once in a while, the federal government is forced through court decisions to give up more land to Indigenous people, and we're slowly trying to make it better. That's the way we see it. But to Indigenous people, the land is only part of the equation. It's not the whole thing. We can get a clue to what that extra thing is by looking at today's story. Because in the story, of course, Jesus doesn't give any land at all to anybody. It's not about land. It's about the state of that poor man's mind. The man is being possessed by demons, so his brain's completely scrambled. He's lost his personal identity, and it's been replaced by all these demons buzzing around in his head. He's lost who he is. He's no longer the Jew that he was before. Instead, he's possessed by these Gentile demons. And so Jesus realizes that his liberation needs to be a mental liberation as much as a physical one. So he frees this man's mind. He gets the demons to transfer, and they're dealt with, and this man manages to come back to his sanity. He manages to get his identity back. What's interesting, though, is that the locals, the Gentile locals who come by and see this herd of pigs in the water, they don't care at all about what happened to this man who formerly had been possessed by these demons. They don't even mention him. All they care about are the economic consequences of his liberation. They see a herd, an expensive herd of dead pigs, and they say, please, you, Jewish Galilean, get out of here. Don't cause any more trouble. Leave. But the story suggests that liberation starts up here. If you're not liberated up here, you're not going to be liberated otherwise. And Indigenous people have been making that argument too. For them, as I said before, colonization has a few stages. They got conquered, they didn't go away, and they dream of a future where they won't be colonized anymore. And today we happen to be living in a kind of renaissance of Indigenous culture. Never before there have been so many novels and movies and music available for everybody to experience that have been written from the Indigenous point of view. And in this way, they are the inconvenient Indians that Thomas King spoke about. And that they're not going away. They're saying, no, actually, we can fight colonialization by proving that we weren't erased. The residential school system didn't work, that we still have our own way of seeing and being in this world. And by insisting on what it is and showing how it is different from the Western colonizing point of view, we can show that colonization doesn't actually work, that we are resisting it merely by being here and expressing our point of view. So the work of people like Tanya Talaga and Thomas King, obviously, and the late Richard Wagamese, all sorts of wonderful authors who are sharing the Indigenous point of view as a way of proving that colonization doesn't get the last word, that they haven't been conquered, that they're still here. And it's funny, often Indigenous writers will complain, I'm promoting my new book, and I get a spot on a radio show, and they say, okay, can you read us a selection that sounds Indigenous? That's got maybe teepees in it, or talk about your love of the land, or spirits or something, something that sounds Indigenous. And many of these authors have said, hey, if I wrote it, it's Indigenous. Like, I'm an Indigenous writer because I'm Indigenous and I write stuff. It doesn't have to be about the past. It doesn't have to be about when we were Indians that way back then. I want to write about what it's like to be an Indigenous person right now. And when you read their novels and their stories and their poems, there's Star Wars references and Lord of the Rings, and there's talk about cars and old movies because they're living right now. Of course they're living right now. Where else are they supposed to live? But their literature and their stories are about what it's like to be Indigenous in our time, understanding it and trying to prove that we're still here, but we have a different perspective on this. And that's a political act in that if they can think through the world from an Indigenous point of view now, it means there's another way of being in this world. There's another way of being here that maybe won't result in the destruction of the environment. That maybe isn't about who's on top, who's on bottom, but maybe everybody matters. And part of the colonial mindset, right, is that there is no future for conquered people. They just assimilate. Well, one of the things which is interesting about how Indigenous culture is playing out is that they found science fiction to be a really, really helpful way of looking at the world because they get to imagine what the world would look like after colonization. There's a wonderful teen novel called Marrow Thieves by Sherry Damelin. And in it, global warming has caused a disease which has affected everybody's minds. All the white people's minds have become affected so that they can't dream anymore. When they go to sleep, there are no dreams. And without dreams, they're driven mad. So they go hunting Indigenous people, not for their land this time, but for their marrow, because out of the marrow they can extract stuff which can restore the white ability to dream. So this story is a wonderful allegory about how it's not actually the land anymore, but what's in their heads, what's in an Indigenous mind, which is valuable, which of course is what is valuable to Indigenous people themselves. Thomas King writes elsewhere in his Massey lecture, he says, the first thing you got to understand is we are ultimately about our stories. Our stories and our dreamings is who we are. And in these science fiction novels, they imagine what it would be like if Indigenous people prevailed and that the colonial way of thinking went away. In the story today, at the end, Jesus says to the man who's been dispossessed of the spirits, the man says, please, take me with you. And Jesus says, no. I want you to go back to your village and tell them what God has done for you. Go back and tell your town, which is probably a mixture of Jews and Gentiles, that you have been freed from this possession. I think that's what's happening now, right here in Canada. I think Indigenous people are asserting that their minds are free, and they're coming back to our collective town, a mixture of settlers and Indigenous people, and saying, there's another way of being, and I want to share that good news with you. I don't want you to become me. I don't want you to become white Indians. That's no solution. You got to find your own way. But they are sharing their culture with us in a way that is a real gift, and something that on a National Indigenous Day of Prayer, we should recognize that we are not eulogizing people who were conquered, but praying with and for people who are still here, still active, and still have enough love in them to think that there's hope for them and for us. That is a great blessing. Amen.